Բարև ձեզ, Factor TV-ի եթերում դուք դիտում եք ապոլիտիկ հաղորդաշարը։ Այն, որ եվրոպական արժեքները մեզ հայերիս համար պետք է լինեն առանցքային եւ առանցքային նշանակություն ունենան, ինձ համար գոնե կասկածից վեր է։ Եվ դրա պատճառներից մեկն այն է, իմ կարծիքով, որ այդ արժեքների ստեղծողներից մեկը նաեւ մենք ենք, մեր ժողովուրդներ։ Իսկ ցուցիչը այդ արժեքների այն է, որ մենք պետք է հանդուրժող լինենք, լայնախոհ լինենք եւ հանդուրժենք նույնիսկ նրանց, ովքեր այդ արժեքները չեն դավանում։ Եվ այսօր իմ զրուցակիցն է Հայաստանում Նիդերլանդների թագավորության դեսպան Nicolaas Schermers-ը։ Շնորհակալ եմ պարոն դեսպան մեր հաղորդմանը մասնակցելու համար։ Մենք մեր խոսակցությունը կշարունակենք անգլերեն։ What do European values mean for you? Is that correct concept? Because European countries and nations are so different.
Շնորհակալություն, շատ ուրախ եմ հանդիպել ձեզ հետ եւ շատ հպարտ եմ ներկա լինել այստեղ այսօր եւ շարունակեմ անգլերեն. What do European values mean to me? I think many of the values are not necessarily European values, but are universal values. If we talk about human rights in general, those are values we have committed to as human race together in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. What do they mean to me? I think what I value most, and that is what I realize more and more when I'm not living in the Netherlands, is that many of those values are not always in all countries worldwide as obvious as they are in my own country. And I'm not saying that my country is perfect. Also in my country, in the Netherlands, we need to change things. We need to constantly work on having those values and norms implemented. We have many problems in that regard, but I still think that I have grown up in in a Cold War situation, and after that we had no war anymore in Europe. I've also grown up. I've been growing up in an environment where freedom was available for everyone, everywhere. And I remember very well that as a kid we used to travel we lived in the south of the Netherlands, and sometimes when we were traveling, my father was very much anxious that he would miss somewhere one of the turnoffs at the highway, because then we would end up in Belgium and we didn't have our passports with us. So that is the situation I grew up with, but nowadays there are no borders between the Netherlands and Belgium.
European Union.
Exactly, and that is what is the new generation, my own children, have been growing up with. They don't know borders within Europe anymore. They know that freedom. They pay with euros everywhere. They don't know that in the past we had a pocket full of money because we were going to Belgium, to France, to Germany, and you needed to have all these coins with you. So that is something that has changed over the last 30 years, and that has made many people in Europe perhaps a little bit, well, I wouldn't say lazy, but I think many Europeans have taken this liberty, this freedom for granted. And that is, I think, what is very dear to me, and what I realize when I'm abroad, when I'm living in other countries, that this is not for granted. We have to work on this everywhere, and that is also what I try to do, what I try to bring in my work as ambassador of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Armenia, to show that this is not something we want to extrapolate to other countries, but that we believe in is the right for every human to live in, to have this kind of liberty, to have this kind of freedom to make choices people want with what they want to do with their own lives.
Are Christian values involved in those?
Perhaps I wouldn't say Christian values as such are dominating in that regard. I grew up in a Christian environment. However, I also went to Catholic schools, I lived in Muslim countries, I lived in a country where also Buddhism and Hinduism was practiced. So I've seen many of the religions, and I think that religious values stem from a time that we all tried to make these values, the human values, our own, and we tried to perhaps codify them in the religions. And I think that this, every religion is somehow trying to live up to these common values, these universal values from its own perspective.
The first Armenian Bible was printed famously in Amsterdam. Is there a notion in Netherlands or in Europe generally that Armenian culture is Christian?
Not necessarily. I think that if I ask the average Dutch citizen about Armenia, then they realize, it's probably a country somewhere, but they don't know where. And that is, I think, also the importance of being an ambassador of the Netherlands here in Armenia, to bring that knowledge to my own country fellows, to tell them about Armenia. And I think that many Dutch people who know a little bit about the region sympathize with Armenia, with Armenian values, because you have demonstrated, especially with the revolution in 2018, that you stand for the same values as we do, that you want to have these freedoms, the human rights respected, and that is something that appeals to Dutch people. Perhaps also another example, the other way around, what is not known to many Dutch people, but neither to Armenians, is that Christianity came to the Netherlands through Armenia. And that was by the first bishop, the Roman Catholic bishop we had in Maastricht in the south of the Netherlands. He arrived in 347, became the first Roman Catholic bishop, and from there Christianity spread into the Netherlands. But he came from Armenia. Sint Servaas was his name, Sint Servatius. Coming from Armenia, he was the one that brought Christianity in those days already. He died, I think, in 374, so was for, 27 years the bishop in the Netherlands. And that is how it, where we also see a strong link between Armenia and the Netherlands.
About Christianity, what's the role of religion in secular countries like Netherlands or Armenia?
It used to be, it used to have a very strong role, but basically I can say that our independence also was based on it. In the 1500s, we were a part of the Kingdom of Spain under Charles V. He was the King of Spain, but also Lord of the Netherlands. His son Philip II acceded to the throne in 1555, if I'm correct, plus or minus a couple of years. But in any case, in the meantime, Luther had already started his religious thoughts, to spread his religious thoughts in Germany, and also came to the Netherlands in that respect. So Protestantism had emerged and was very popular in the Netherlands. We are a very practical country, and therefore people started to ask questions about all the rules and regulations that were imposed by the Roman Catholic Church to the Dutch people, and therefore many became Protestant. That led to an 80 years war between the Netherlands and Spain, which in the end resulted in the how do you say that, the independence of the Netherlands in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. And from that moment on, we also had internal struggles between different parts of the Netherlands. The south was still Roman Catholic. Within Protestantism, you had different strands as well. So it became clear that we also needed to find a solution in that regard. And I think that was the basis for our separation of church and state. That was complex because from I think the early 20th century until 1967, more or less, the year I was born actually, we see a division in the Netherlands, and we call it a kind of pillarization of society. We had 4 pillars in society, and 2 of them were basically religious ones. We had a social, a liberal, a Catholic and a Protestant pillar. And our society was completely segregated. We had a Protestant news channel, we had a Protestant church, the Protestant television, newspaper, we had Protestant shops, we had Catholic shops, we had liberal shops. So everyone went within their own pillar. They lived within their own pillar. You had unions, the employer organizations, so it was all organized along these pillars, and only the leaders of the pillars were interacting with each other to make society work. And we had also the schools organized along these pillarization. And that worked pretty well until the end of the 60s. At that stage, that system more or less started to collapse, and Christianity therefore also became less and less important. So people started to no longer go to church, and that is where we are now. Still some remnants of the old system are left. But that is more or less the role of Christianity in Dutch society.
It is very interesting about segregation. I didn't know about it. But your environment is Catholic, yes?
Not necessarily. My father was a Protestant, and he started to live in the south of the Netherlands, which is entirely Catholic. So I grew up in a small Protestant island in the south of the Netherlands, in a Catholic environment. And later I went also to a Catholic school. I've seen a couple of sides of Dutch society in that regard, not knowing at the time that it was so organized, of course.
Free market and democracy in Netherlands have been prominent for centuries, as you mentioned. The notion of social contract and freedom of speech has been proposed by Benedict Spinoza in the 17th century. Firstly, can we claim that those 2 aspects, political and economic, are related? For example, freedom of speech and free market. Social contract and free market, are they related to each other?
I certainly believe so, because I think that the moment that there is free speech, that means that people feel free to really develop their talents. That means that you will find a high level of innovation in society, and when free speech is there, that means that the government is protecting that free speech. That means that they also protect the rule of law as such, and that is always good for entrepreneurs because they know they are usually not afraid to pay taxes, but they want stability, they want clarity, they want to be able to calculate the costs that may incur in running a business. So whenever there is rule of law and freedom of speech and this kind of liberties, it is good for the economy, because then people will develop their talents, and as I said, then you will find a lot of innovation.
And secondly, are relations established in your country irreversible and no longer problematic?
I hope so, but we can certainly not take that for granted, and that is what we see also nowadays, and I think that social media also play a role in that. It creates a kind of a distance between people, and there is no social, maybe to come back on your previous question, the social contract is perhaps a little bit less towards the not only the rights but also the duties of citizens. And that is, I think, where we have as government but also as citizens to pay attention to, that we respect the other people in society, that you cannot say everything like hate speech. That doesn't contribute to this kind of values and is a threat in the end. So therefore we have to work from a large side, and that is not only at the government side by trying to do something against hate speech, but it starts already in schools, with small children. The pestering of other children is not something that is acceptable. That you have to have respect for others. So that has to start from a very early age.
From kindergarten, I think.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I think that answers your question. But I wanted to add one more thing. And that is also something where perhaps my country has something to learn from Armenia, because where we succeeded in getting a lot of democracy and a free market at the one hand, we run the risk of losing the social fabric. And that is something I admired very much in Armenia, that you have that social fabric here very strong in your country, and that is something that is of tremendous value, that people care about each other, which creates a very safe environment for people, for children, and therefore also is a kind of an area where things can flourish.
Does democracy affect the level of safety, of security in a country? For instance, how were the problem of safety during the pandemic solved in Netherlands?
I think in the long run, if the institutions function well, democracy indeed is a guarantee for security. It will bring security. What we sometimes see is that that is not perfectly organized, and then also democracies face struggles and challenges. And that was another one I mentioned. I reported back to my colleagues in The Hague during the pandemic when I was here, and there were many political demonstrations in Armenia. We also had our problems in the Netherlands with handling the pandemic as such. There were protests in various cities. We had many youngsters who were unhappy. There were demonstrations against the police, and police cars were set on fire. There were plunderings. So many things happened, and that is where I come back to this social fabric you have in Armenia, that whatever happened, almost all the demonstrations I've witnessed, and I was located at the Marriott in Republic Square. So I had a good view on many of the demonstrations. It all, well, not all, but most of them went very, very frankly and with respect to the police on the one hand and to the demonstrators on the other hand. So that is something again where we can learn from Armenia.
Such critical situations like pandemic require some restrictions, and that contradicts the freedom. Yes.
Yes. Certainly, and that I think was in the beginning also very difficult in the Netherlands to accept. At the same time, we also noticed that people were usually sticking to the rules. Certainly in the beginning, when everything was uncertain. Of course, it requires difficult measures to be taken by the government. But I think that all the governments in the world were taking their own measures. In my own country, again, I'm not sure whether everything went well, but in the Dutch circumstances, we did a number of things that certainly helped us in getting through the pandemic. It wasn't perfect again, but if I look how the citizens were acting in, especially the beginning of the pandemic, they were very much listening to the government, and the government was democratically elected.
Can democracy be exported from Western Europe to other countries, for example, to post-Soviet countries or Middle East state, or it is impossible?
I think it's certainly possible, but the question is not so much whether we want to export it. I think it's much more important whether those countries want to import it. I think it's very important that people in other countries, the non-European countries, should be open to have this kind of freedom to decide who is going to govern you. And I think that is something where we have a long-standing practice in the Netherlands and in many European countries. In post-Soviet republics, that is sometimes still difficult because there, of course, was not this practice of freedom and being able to elect the leaders you want to have. That is something where the EU and also the Netherlands is trying to contribute in many countries, including Armenia, to support those institutions, those civil society organizations, those in government who are working on this, to strengthen democracy, to make it possible for people to really have a free choice who to choose as leader and how to choose the future of their countries.
If they elect by free election, they elect some autocrat, some anti-democratic person. Is it okay?
I think that a true democracy will not lead to such a choice. But of course, there is always the risk. We've seen that in history, and that is also something my own government is always trying to take care of. I think that if you have elected at some point a democratic government that is having such a policy that autocrats get an opportunity to stand up, then there should be checks and balances in the democratic system itself to make sure that that government is going to change its course.
Can those countries, non-European countries, adopt some ethical or administrative patterns which are common for Western Europe?
I think they certainly can, but it always depends on the situation in the countries themselves. How are countries organized? What state institutions are functioning and which ones are not? What is the culture? And I think that first and foremost, it's important that the leadership of the country is expressing the will of the people to become democratic and to strengthen democracy. And then I think many countries like the Netherlands, but many other European countries as well, stand ready to see what exactly these countries need and how to help them. What I've been doing in the past in my job as a diplomat is never telling countries how to organize their system. I'm always explaining how we are organized, what questions we have faced in the past, what questions we are facing now. And from that we had certain answers. Well, these questions we asked may help other countries to ask the same question but maybe come to a different answer.
Some standards accept by society, while other tend to provoke reservation. For example, I think that Armenia joining Council of Europe, it is a very positive effect. The prohibition of death penalty, for example, it is okay. I agree, because I think government or state cannot be killer. It's okay. But the issues concerning gender, for example, invoke skepticism in many.
Yeah, and that brings me again to the freedoms, the liberties you want to have in society. And if I look at my own country, we are still debating and reorganizing ourselves to really become an equal country for all. At the moment, also in the Netherlands, the gender balance is not well organized. We don't have gender equity in many sectors. We don't accept, I guess, in many sectors that non-Dutch citizens are getting certain jobs. So we also have this bias in our own society. But that also means that we are not maximizing the talent pool in our own society, and I think that is also happening in Armenia in that regard, and that is why, I think that sometimes Armenia is like many other countries, and again also like the Netherlands, not using its full potential to develop itself. To that extent, the EU, but again also the Netherlands, my own embassy, has a strong program to support certain minorities in Armenian society, but also we have a strong gender policy. Gender equity is something we try to help establish in Armenia. And I have to say there that Armenia is a very particular country. I think many of the rules and regulations are in place, and indeed also because of the Council of Europe membership. But it's also something that society needs to embrace and to start realizing.
The links between Armenia and the European Union, particularly Netherlands, in aspects of civil society, media, democratic institutions. Which ways would you like those links to develop?
What we try to do from our embassy is to expose as many Dutch people from different parts of society to Armenia. And we do that by inviting them here for different projects. If we need an expert in a certain area, I try to bring that expert from the Netherlands. Because what I have seen so far is that the strong and pretty big Dutch Armenian diaspora is quite active and is also trying to work on these Dutch-Armenian relations. But what we also need to have is people who don't have any links with Armenia to start to learn about Armenia. So we bring them here to show them Armenia, to show what Armenia stands for, and to show all the positive and perhaps also the negative sides of your country. And so far I've noticed that everyone who has visited Armenia from the Netherlands goes back with a feeling, wow, I had not expected this and I want to come back. Mm-hmm. So that is what we try to do. And we do it also the other way around, of course. We try to bring Armenians to the Netherlands. Also to tell the story of Armenia in the Netherlands. Is
it necessary to feel cultural shock to understand the country, the culture of the country?
I think it certainly is, because just learning about a country, and not necessarily only about a country, I think it also applies to organizations. I remember very well that I had when I was a student, I had a professor and who taught us all about the European Union, and I knew all the various parts of the European Union, what they were doing, until I was posted in Brussels and was on the inside of the organizations, and then you really start to realize this is how it works. So you can learn a lot from theory. But especially when it's cultural, when you have to interact with other societies, you have to experience the society as such, because otherwise I think you cannot really appreciate what a country is doing. And I have another example. When I was in Egypt, posted in Egypt, there was a Dutch journalist who is quite famous nowadays, who wrote a book about how Egyptians were living. Mm-hmm. And in the Netherlands it was a bestseller. And people asked me, wow, I really was laughing about this book. It was so good and really funny and lots of humor. And then I realized when I read the book, I wasn't laughing. When I read the book, I understood what he was writing. And to an outsider that felt humorous, but to someone who knows the other culture, it was a kind of recognition, and I didn't have any value added to it or so. I didn't judge the writings, but it was just a very good description of Egyptian society. And that is what I think is also happening when people are coming to live in a country. Then they are submerged into society, they get to know the people, they get to know the habits, they start to understand why the habits are as they are, and that is when you really start to appreciate a different culture. So I fully subscribe to it.
Did you feel that shock in positive or in negative way when you get acquainted with Armenian culture?
Yes, and well, mostly in a positive way, I would say. I really have come to appreciate Armenia and Armenians in the way you act, in the way you're quite open, and that is what we Dutch are famous for. That we're very blunt, but I think that Armenians are blunt enough for us to really appreciate and to work with. I think that Armenians are also very hospitable, and that is something I've never encountered in the world before. This hospitality is extreme. That whenever I go to a small village in somewhere in the country, I will be invited for coffee within 10 minutes. And I can visit any house in that regard, and people really appreciate it. And not because I'm an ambassador, but just they know that I'm a stranger, I don't belong in the village, and they want to tell about their village, and they want to show their hospitality. So that is really very good. Maybe one comment on the negative side, because that is also an example I'd like to use. What Armenians, I think that Armenia is not a very densely populated country. The Netherlands is one of the densest populated countries in the world. I think after Taiwan and Bangladesh, we're number 3 in that regard. That means that we have to be very careful with our space. Many people are packed in small places. That means that we also are very efficient when we walk in public. We always stick to the right, so that it's very easy to pass by. If you walk in Armenian streets, it's for a Dutch person a nightmare. That people are all over the place. They walk 6 people wide, and only at the last minute they squeeze in so that you can pass. And that is something I really had to get used to.
Եվ մեր հաղորդման վերջին էջը, որը կոչվում է հայացք ապագային։ Dear Ambassador Schermers, is it possible that someday the notion of eternal peace that were proposed in 18th century by so-called Enlightenment period can come to life?
I certainly hope so. I think that at the moment it sometimes looks very grim, the situation in the world, the situation in the region. At the same time, as I started this interview with mentioning that I grew up in a Cold War period, at the time, I think it was in the 80s, I once visited Australia, and people were asking me how it felt living under the constant threat of Russian nuclear missiles and war, and I didn't realize it at the time. I was a high school student. But now, many years later, if you look back to, if I look to my own children, they don't even know that notion. They have seen that Europe is a project that has been very successful in that regard. We have brought peace to a continent that was torn by wars for many centuries, I would say, or maybe even millennia. And now for decades it's reasonably quiet on in any case the western part of that continent. So I think that if people really want, that we are able to establish that.
Շնորհակալ եմ պարոն դեսպան, շատ հետաքրքիր զրույցի համար։
Շնորհակալություն։
Սիրելի բարեկամներ, ես հիշեցնեմ, որ իմ զրուցակիցն էր Հայաստանում Նիդերլանդերի թագավորության դեսպան Նիկոլաս Սխերմերսը։